Dr. Alana Miller was known to her colleagues and friends as a brilliant and compassionate heart surgeon. Behind her warm smile and gentle demeanor, she had spent years building a reputation in the medical field, a reputation rooted in skill, resilience, and countless hours of dedication. But outside the hospital walls, in places where her white coat and professional titles weren't visible, people rarely saw her for who she truly was. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and Dr. Miller had just finished a long shift. She was tired but excited, looking forward to a rare outing with her teenage daughter, Leela. They planned to catch a movie, grab some lunch, and simply enjoy the day. As they walked through the bustling plaza, Alana was just another woman blending into the crowd, her status and accomplishments unseen. She had purposely dressed down in jeans and a simple hoodie to relax and escape her everyday role. Leela, walking a few steps ahead, had her headphones in, smiling softly as she glanced back at her mother. That's when Officer Blake noticed them. He was stationed nearby, supposedly monitoring the crowd, but his gaze fixed on Dr. Miller and Leela. To him, they didn't look like they belonged there, not in this upscale part of town, not near the expensive stores and pristine cafes. He looked them over, a dismissive sneer forming on his face. As Alana and Leela stopped to take in the scene around them, Officer Blake approached, his posture rigid and imposing, his voice filled with a sharp authority. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, directing his attention to Leela. His tone was condescending, almost as if he were speaking to a misbehaving child. "Where do you think you're going? Do you have business around here?" Leela looked up, startled by the sudden confrontation. Alana quickly stepped forward, sensing the tension, but Officer Blake didn't even glance in her direction. He seemed focused on his assumptions, treating them with a disdain that felt too familiar. To him, they were merely two people out of place, two people he could intimidate without consequence. "We're just here to enjoy the day," Alana responded calmly, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. She had encountered people like Officer Blake before, people who saw her skin color or her casual clothes before her dignity and identity. But she kept her composure, even as she sensed his growing hostility. Officer Blake wasn't convinced. "I don't think you understand. People don't just wander around here unless they're up to something," he said, his eyes narrowing. He leaned in closer, his stance aggressive as he looked Alana up and down with a smirk that was all too telling. Officer Blake's scrutiny intensified, his gaze lingering on Leela with a cold, judgmental glint. To him, the young girl looked out of place, and he seemed intent on making her feel that way. Lila, who'd been excited for a simple day out with her mother, now found herself shrinking under the officer's harsh stare. She glanced nervously at her mother, her smile fading as the weight of the situation settled over her. Dr. Miller felt the tension in her daughter's posture, a mix of confusion and fear that no teenager should ever have to experience. "Listen, young lady," Officer Blake continued, his tone growing sharper. "I ask you a question. Are you or your mother planning to cause any trouble here today?" Dr. Miller's jaw clenched, but she maintained her composure, trying to shield Leela from the growing hostility. "We're just here to enjoy our day, officer," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. But Blake wasn't interested in her words. His mind was already made up. He saw them as intruders, a disruption to the orderly world he believed he was protecting. The officer scoffed, crossing his arms as if he were waiting for them to slip up, his posture brimming with misplaced authority. "Enjoy your day," he echoed with mock surprise, his eyes narrowing. "Funny, you don't seem like the type who can afford to enjoy the day around here." His tone was laced with condescension, and he smirked as he took a step closer, casting a shadow over Leela. The implication hung in the air, thick and heavy, and the crowd around them began to take notice. People started to murmur, a few casting judgmental glances in their direction, others uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Leela shifted uneasily, her fingers tightening around her phone, and Dr. Miller knew her daughter was getting increasingly distressed. But the doctor held her ground, her gaze unwavering. She dealt with this type of prejudice before: dismissive comments, unwarranted skepticism of her abilities, and the subtle hostility she faced when people underestimated her. However, seeing her daughter subjected to such treatment ignited a deep, quiet anger within her. The officer's condescending gaze returned to Leela. "Where are you from, young lady?" he asked, his tone sharp and invasive. "I want to make sure I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Leela looked at her mother, seeking reassurance, and Dr. Miller gave her a slight nod, urging her to stay calm. She could feel the unease radiating from her daughter, and every fiber of her being wanted to put an end to this. But Dr. Miller understood the delicate balance of handling someone like Officer Blake. Showing any hint of frustration or impatience could easily be twisted into resisting authority or acting suspiciously. She had to keep her emotions in check, not only for her own sake, but to protect her daughter from further intimidation. "We live in this city," Dr. Miller replied with quiet firmness, her eyes never leaving Officer Blake's. "We have every right to be here, just like anyone else." Blake's smirk widened, as if her words were an open invitation for further disrespect. "Is that so?" he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He looked her up and down, clearly doubting her response, as though their presence in such an upscale area was an affront to him personally. To him, they didn't belong. Not here, not on his watch, and he seemed determined to make them understand that. "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing here," he said, leaning closer, his voice low and threatening. "But if you and your daughter are planning any trouble, I'll be right here to put an end to it." Dr. Miller's heart pounded, her hands clenching at her sides, as she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't just an everyday confrontation. She could sense the malice behind Blake's words, a deeper resentment that went beyond simple authority. She saw his eyes, the way they narrowed with suspicion, with a disdain he didn't bother to hide. And yet, even as her frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior, she held back, watching, waiting. In her years as a doctor, she had faced unimaginable challenges, crises that had tested her patience and resilience. She had saved countless lives under pressure, had learned the art of controlling her emotions in the most intense situations. But this was different. The stakes felt even higher because it was her daughter being targeted, her daughter who was standing there, vulnerable, under the weight of unjustified suspicion. The tension hung in the air, and Dr. Miller could feel the eyes of the bystanders on them. Some watched in silence, too afraid or indifferent to speak up, while others exchanged glances of quiet sympathy, recognizing the injustice playing out before them, but unwilling to step forward. Officer Blake's hand lingered near his radio, a silent reminder that he had the power to escalate things at any moment, to call in backup if he deemed it necessary. But Dr. Miller was not easily intimidated. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, a resilience that Blake could not see. Though he underestimated her now, he had no idea who he was dealing with, no clue of the consequences waiting just around the corner. She took a deep breath, meeting his stare with a calm intensity, silently reminding herself to stay patient. She knew that, despite his bravado, he was unprepared for what was about to unfold. The tables were about to turn, and Officer Blake was closer than ever to a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Officer Blake's mocking stare didn't faze Dr. Miller as much as he expected. She remained calm, her gaze steady and unfaltering. Lila clung closer to her mother, sensing a quiet intensity in her that was beginning to shift the tone of the encounter. Dr. Miller's response was unhurried, almost as if she was measuring each word, calculating the impact they would have. Though Officer Blake didn't realize it yet, he was on the edge of a situation far beyond his control. Leela glanced up at her mother, noticing the slight but unmistakable shift in her expression. There was something in Dr. Miller's eyes, a confidence, a kind of inner strength that she had often seen during her mother's late-night discussions about her work at the hospital. Leela had always known her mother was tough, but this was something different. Dr. Miller's demeanor, calm but unyielding, sent a subtle message. She wasn't here to be bullied, and she wasn't backing down. "You know, Dr. Miller finally said, her tone polite yet firm. "I'd like to know your badge number, Officer Blake. It seems that you have a very particular way of dealing with people around here." Her words were laced with a quiet authority that Officer Blake hadn't expected, and he hesitated, if only for a fraction of a second, before composing himself again. His smirk faltered slightly, just enough to hint at the beginning of a shift in the power dynamic. "Oh, I think you're the one who should be giving me information, ma'am," Blake retorted, his voice laced with forced bravado. "But if you're so interested, I suppose I can humor you." He rattled off his badge number, clearly expecting her to drop the matter. But Dr. Miller simply nodded, taking mental note, her expression unreadable. Lila noticed the way her mother's gaze sharpened, a hint of something almost calculating flashing in her eyes. It was subtle, but it was there, a tiny signal that her mother wasn't simply going to let this go. As Officer Blake continued his probing, making veiled threats and sarcastic remarks, Dr. Miller subtly reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. She glanced at the screen, her fingers moving with a practiced ease as she sent a quick, discreet message. It was a small action, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but it felt like the first crack in the tension that surrounded them. Blake didn't seem to notice, absorbed in his own theatrics, but Lila caught the movement, sensing that something significant was in motion. Lila watched as her mother straightened, a quiet confidence settling over her, one that seemed to radiate outward. Dr. Miller was not intimidated. She wasn't pleading or explaining herself. She was waiting, almost as if she was silently inviting Blake to continue digging himself into a deeper hole. And as she waited, her presence seemed to grow, filling the space between them with an unspoken authority that made the bystanders pause, some even leaning in as if sensing a shift in the dynamic. Officer Blake's monologue faltered as he noticed the crowd watching. His smug expression turned slightly defensive, his gaze flickering around as he realized the attention was no longer in his favor. Dr. Miller's unbroken eye contact unsettled him, a small but undeniable indication that she was not intimidated by his threats or his authority. Blake's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, distracted for a moment. Dr. Miller didn't miss a beat, her voice calm yet undeniably commanding as she spoke again, catching his attention. "I'm sure you're aware of the rules surrounding conduct, Officer Blake. You seem, well, familiar with bending them." Her words were soft, yet they struck with the weight of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. The subtle accusation in her tone was unmistakable, and Officer Blake's face paled ever so slightly. He opened his mouth to retort, but just then, Dr. Miller's phone rang. She answered it calmly, her voice dropping to a low, professional tone as she spoke briefly and nodded, confirming something before ending the call. It was a seemingly ordinary action, but there was something about the timing, the confidence in her tone, that unsettled Blake further. Lila watched, a flicker of pride and relief rising in her as she saw the slight crack in Officer Blake's demeanor. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, some people raising their phones to record. Dr. Miller's subtle shift in body language and the quiet, assertive way she handled the call gave a small hint to everyone around that she was far more than she appeared to be. For the first time, Blake hesitated, glancing uneasily at the crowd, his grip on his authority slipping as Dr. Miller calmly met his gaze, showing not a trace of fear or submission. Another officer, dressed in a higher-ranking uniform, appeared at the edge of the crowd, his expression stern as he approached. Dr. Miller's subtle glance in his direction confirmed to Lila that her mother had planned this all along. The officer caught sight of Dr. Miller and nodded, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He turned to Officer Blake, his voice carrying a weight of authority that immediately silenced the murmuring crowd. "Blake," the officer said sharply, "a word, if you please." The higher-ranking officer's presence shifted the entire atmosphere, and Blake's face went from smug to stunned in a matter of seconds. Dr. Miller offered him a calm, knowing smile as he turned to face his superior, the realization settling in that he was no longer in control of this situation. Lila could see her mother's subtle satisfaction, the unspoken message in her eyes that hinted at the larger truth Officer Blake was about to discover. Officer Blake stood rigid, his eyes darting from the higher-ranking officer to Dr. Miller, a look of confusion and disbelief slowly overtaking his once smug expression. His superior, Captain Harris, looked him up and down, disappointment written plainly across his face. The tension in the air was palpable, with the crowd watching closely, phones recording every second of the unfolding scene. Captain Harris turned to Dr. Miller, his demeanor respectful and warm. "Dr. Miller," he greeted her, extending a hand. "I apologize for any inconvenience. I assure you, this behavior does not reflect the standards of our department." His words were clear and formal, but the undertone was unmistakable. Officer Blake's mouth dropped slightly as he looked from his captain to Dr. Miller, trying to make sense of the exchange. "Thank you, Captain Harris," Dr. Miller replied, her voice calm but carrying a confidence that left no room for misinterpretation. She shook his hand, her gaze never leaving Blake's. The revelation was beginning to dawn on him, but he wasn't ready for the full weight of it. Dr. Miller paused, giving him a long, steady look. "I had hoped our day would be peaceful, but it seems Officer Blake here had other plans." The captain nodded solemnly before turning back to Blake. "Do you have any idea who you've been speaking to?" he asked, his voice laced with restrained anger. Blake stammered, the arrogance draining from his face as he tried to maintain some semblance of control. I didn't realize," Blake muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "She didn't say who she was." Captain Harris shook his head, visibly disappointed. "You didn't bother to ask, did you? You made assumptions, Officer Blake, and those assumptions have consequences." He gestured to Dr. Miller, inviting her to continue. Dr. Miller took a small step forward, her expression steady and composed. "You see, Officer Blake," she began, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "I'm Dr. Alana Miller, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at State Hospital. I'm a surgeon, and I'm often called upon to treat people in high-stress situations. I'm also an advisor for community health initiatives, one of which involves overseeing training for first responders, including law enforcement." Blake's face turned ghostly pale as Dr. Miller's words sank in. His assumptions, his arrogance, all unraveled in an instant. The woman he had attempted to humiliate, to intimidate, was not only well respected in her field, but someone with direct ties to the police force. The realization hit him hard, and his lips trembled as he opened his mouth, struggling for words. Dr. Miller continued, unflinching. "It's individuals like you, Officer Blake, who make it difficult for the public to trust law enforcement. And today, your actions have consequences." She reached into her bag and held up her phone, displaying the recording she had captured of his behavior, his every derogatory word and threat documented in full. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, and Blake's eyes widened as he realized the weight of the evidence against him. Captain Harris cleared his throat, his voice icy as he addressed Blake. "You've overstepped, officer. This footage alone is enough to warrant an investigation, and given Dr. Miller's role in this community, I assure you this will be handled swiftly." Blake looked around, desperation creeping into his eyes. The authority he had wielded so recklessly was slipping from his grasp. "Captain, please," he started, but Dr. Miller's firm voice cut him off. "No, Officer Blake," she said, holding his gaze. "You made it clear that you judged me and my daughter based on nothing more than prejudice, and today you'll face the consequences of that choice." Her words were measured, leaving no room for argument or appeal. Captain Harris nodded to two other officers who had arrived, gesturing for them to escort Blake away. As they approached him, Blake's shoulders slumped, resignation setting in as he realized there was no escape. The crowd watched as the officers led him away, whispers of approval and satisfaction filling the air. Justice had been served. Turning back to Dr. Miller, Captain Harris offered her an apologetic look. "Once again, Dr. Miller, I apologize for his behavior. We're committed to making sure officers like him don't tarnish our department's reputation. I appreciate your patience and professionalism through all of this." Dr. Miller nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you, Captain. I understand that it's a complex issue, but this is exactly why accountability matters." She glanced at Leela, who stood by her side, relief and pride shining in her eyes. The confrontation was over, and the tables had turned in a way that left no doubt about Dr. Miller's strength and resilience. As she and her daughter walked away from the scene, the crowd parted, some offering quiet words of encouragement, others nodding in admiration. Lila looked up at her mother, a newfound understanding in her gaze. "Mom, I had no idea you could handle something like that." Dr. Miller smiled, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Sometimes, Leela, the best way to handle someone's arrogance is to let them see for themselves just how wrong they are. And remember, strength doesn't always mean raising your voice. It means standing firm in who you are." As Officer Blake was led away by his colleagues, the reality of his situation seemed to finally sink in. His once smug, superior demeanor was completely shattered, replaced by a look of disbelief and dread. He had started his day with the confidence that he held power over anyone he deemed unworthy of respect, but now he was on the receiving end of his own prejudices, exposed to the community he had once looked down upon. The crowd that had gathered watched in silence, a collective sense of satisfaction hanging in the air. For them, it was more than just one man facing justice. It was a moment of vindication, a reminder that misuse of authority did not go unchecked. The whispers among them grew louder, a mix of approval and pride in witnessing someone finally stand up to a bully in uniform. Captain Harris, standing beside Dr. Miller, took a deep breath, his voice filled with conviction as he addressed her. "Dr. Miller, please know that this matter won't end here. Officer Blake's conduct today is grounds for disciplinary action, and after our review of the evidence, he will face the consequences in full." He glanced over his shoulder at Blake, who was being led into a squad car, the doors slamming shut behind him. It was a final, resounding reminder of the gravity of his actions. Dr. Miller nodded, her calm, dignified composure unwavering. She knew that her patience and restraint had spoken louder than any argument could have, and she felt a quiet pride that she'd been able to show her daughter the importance of standing up for herself with integrity. She looked down at Leela, who was watching everything with wide eyes, her admiration for her mother practically radiating from her. Dr. Miller gently squeezed her daughter's hand, a silent promise that she would always be there to protect her from injustices, no matter the circumstances. As Captain Harris assured Dr. Miller that his department would take accountability for Blake's actions, a few onlookers approached her, expressions of respect and gratitude on their faces. One older woman, who had been silently watching from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward, her eyes warm with admiration. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "People like you give the rest of us hope. It's not often we get to see someone take a stand against this kind of treatment and win." Dr. Miller smiled softly, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you," she replied. "We all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who we are or where we come from. Today was just a reminder of that." Her words resonated with those around her, leaving a lasting impact on everyone who had witnessed the scene. Meanwhile, Officer Blake's suspension was announced within the department, and it wasn't long before the media picked up the story, sharing footage of the incident that had circulated online. His name quickly became a symbol of caution for others in uniform who thought they could misuse their authority without facing consequences. For Blake, it was a public humiliation, but for the community, it was a long overdue message that justice was alive and well. In the days that followed, Dr. Miller received countless messages of support from people who had witnessed the incident, many expressing their gratitude for her bravery and restraint. Her calm, dignified handling of the situation inspired others, becoming a small but powerful example of how standing up with integrity could change perspectives. Even at the hospital, her colleagues and patients voiced their admiration, treating her with a newfound respect that went beyond her professional reputation. She was no longer just Dr. Miller, the skilled heart surgeon. They saw her as a beacon of strength and resilience, someone who had taken a stand not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced prejudice or discrimination. One afternoon, she and Leela sat on a bench in a quiet corner of the park, reflecting on the events of the past week. Lila looked up at her mother, her voice filled with awe. "Mom, you showed me that sometimes we have to face people like that without fear. I was scared at first, but you never backed down." Dr. Miller smiled, her gaze softening as she looked at her daughter. "Courage isn't about never feeling afraid, Lila. It's about standing up even when you are. And it's about knowing that you deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who you are." She paused, giving Lila a reassuring smile. "Remember, no one has the right to make you feel small. Always know your worth, and don't let anyone take that from you." As they sat there, a peaceful silence settled between them. It was more than a simple mother-daughter moment. It was a passing of strength, a lesson in resilience that Lila would carry with her for the rest of her life. Dr. Miller had shown her that dignity was something no one could take away, that respect was something earned, and that even in the face of injustice, they could hold their heads high. Officer Blake's suspension eventually turned into a formal dismissal, and the department underwent a mandatory review of its practices and training programs. The incident had sparked a conversation within the community, a push for better oversight, and a promise from local leaders that actions would be taken to prevent such abuses of power in the future. Dr. Miller's encounter with Blake became a turning point, a catalyst for change that rippled far beyond that single encounter. In the end, justice had been served, not just for Dr. Miller and Leela, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice. And as they left the park that day, hand in hand, Dr. Miller knew that they had not only reclaimed their own dignity, but had also paved the way for others to do the same. As Dr. Miller and Leela walked away from the park, the weight of recent events lingered in their thoughts, yet it was accompanied by a renewed sense of strength and resolve. What had started as a moment of fear and frustration had transformed into something far more powerful, a lesson in standing up for oneself with dignity and the quiet, unbreakable force of resilience. For Leela, it was a day she would remember forever, a turning point that reshaped her understanding of courage and self-worth. She had watched her mother confront injustice, not with anger or aggression, but with an inner strength that had left a lasting impact on everyone who witnessed it. Dr. Miller knew the road ahead wasn't always going to be smooth. Prejudice and discrimination were challenges that couldn't be erased overnight, but she had shown her daughter something invaluable: that they didn't have to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. They could carve their own path, holding onto their integrity and letting that be their guiding force. In a world where others might try to diminish them, they had the power to define themselves, to stand firmly rooted in their own truth. Looking down at Leela, Dr. Miller offered her a gentle smile. "Sometimes, standing up for yourself doesn't mean shouting the loudest," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "It means knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. You have a strength inside you, Leela. It's always been there. And when you carry yourself with dignity, people will see it, even those who try to ignore it." Leela nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Her mother's words were simple, yet they resonated deeply. She realized now that true power didn't always look like what she had imagined. It wasn't about intimidation or showing authority. It was a quiet, unshakable confidence that spoke volumes without saying a word. She had seen that in her mother's eyes during the confrontation with Officer Blake, an unyielding assurance that had turned the tables without ever raising her voice. In a world where some people misuse their power, strength like yours can be a quiet reminder of what's right, Leela said softly, echoing her mother's lesson. She felt a newfound respect for the courage it took to remain calm in the face of prejudice, to respond with patience and wisdom rather than anger. Her mother had shown her that even when faced with those who would judge or belittle, they could respond with integrity, setting an example that others would remember. As they continued their walk, Dr. Miller thought about the ripple effect of that day. She knew that moments like these, small acts of courage, standing up for what's right, could plant seeds for change in the hearts of those who witnessed them. She hoped that others who saw the recording or heard the story would remember it as a reminder that everyone deserves respect, that prejudice has no place in their community, and maybe, just maybe, it would inspire someone else to stand a little taller, to demand the respect they were owed. "Remember this, Leela," Dr. Miller said, her voice soft but firm. "No matter what others think, no matter how they see you, never doubt your worth. People will try to underestimate you, but don't let their limited perspective hold you back. Your strength lies in knowing who you are, in believing in yourself even when others don't." Leela held her mother's words close, letting them settle in her heart like a quiet promise. She understood now that the world could be unjust, but she also knew she had the tools to face it. She didn't have to fit into anyone's expectations. She didn't have to bow to anyone's judgment. She would carry herself with the dignity her mother had shown her, meeting challenges with grace and an unbreakable sense of self. As they walked home, hand in hand, Leela felt a sense of peace wash over her. Her mother had given her more than just a lesson in courage. She had shown her the strength of resilience, the power of self-respect, and the value of kindness even in the face of adversity. The world might not always be fair, but Leela knew she was ready to meet it, equipped with the quiet power her mother had so beautifully embodied. In the end, it wasn't Officer Blake's authority or threats that had made the lasting impact. It was Dr. Miller's quiet strength, her calm refusal to be intimidated, and her unwavering belief in her own worth. That was the real power, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard, the kind that left a mark far deeper than any act of aggression. And so, as they walked forward together, mother and daughter knew they carried with them a lesson that would last a lifetime. In a world that often fails to recognize people's true value, sometimes the greatest act of defiance is simply knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take it away.